Never in his wildest dreams did Yoshida imagine that someday he'd wake up with a beautiful high school girl cooking for him in his tiny apartment, especially after getting bluntly rejected by his longtime crush. Sayu, the high school girl in question, had run away from home. For months, she survived by letting unknown men use her body in exchange for a place to stay for several nights. One night, she had nowhere to go when, by the red string of fate, she encountered the drunk Yoshida. Surprisingly, the man immediately rejected the services she offered, but he still decided to take her in for some reason. He's letting her stay for as long as she needed, but in return, she has to do the chores and, most importantly, never try to seduce him again. And so the 26-year-old salaryman sheltered the runaway teenager, but as time passes, they're becoming increasingly aware that their unconventional arrangement poses great risks. Despite all this, Yoshida is still willing to let her stay, raising the question of how far the unusual dynamic between these two will reach. Yoshida-san, Sayu kneels before the salaryman with an earnest look on her face. Please, let me get a job. God knows how much time Sayu needed before she mustered up the courage to ask Yoshida something like that. After all, they did agree that her primary task was to do the majority of chores inside the apartment. That's why the girl is so surprised when her housemate unhesitatingly agrees. In fact, Yoshida expresses that he'd feel much better if Sayu landed a job, stating that she's already doing more than enough for the guy. Moreover, staying all day in the apartment won't do any good for her mentally. With this, Sayu is excited to start her part-time job at a nearby convenience store. Thanks to her new position as a front desk cashier, she meets a new friend, Asami, who's worked longer at the store. Thankfully, even though she's Sayu's superior, Asami remains patient and kind while training the newly hired student. When Asami discovers Sayu is living with an older guy, she can't stop asking questions about him. Asami keeps insinuating that he's Sayu's boyfriend, even though the girl already explained he's just like an older brother taking good care of her. But Asami is one tenacious girl and insists on visiting their place to catch a glimpse of this just an older brother guy her new companion just described. Apparently, patience isn't a virtue for this blonde, perky girl. She wants to meet Sayu's intriguing roommate today after they get off work. Meanwhile, Yoshida's still busy on the job, and he's surprised to receive Sayu's message about her coworker. He seems uncertain about the part where he's like an older brother, but there's nothing much to do about it. Not when Sayu notes her friend might stay in their apartment until he gets home. Noticing that he's fiddling with his phone, Yuzuha Mishima and Hashimoto suddenly tease him about the girl. His two colleagues are kind enough to keep his sensitive situation under wraps, but as you can see, they do occasionally get a kick out of annoying him. That night, Yoshida finally arrives at his apartment. As soon as the door opens, yikes! You're an old dude, Asami exclaims. Yoshida's justifiably dumbfounded at Asami's unfiltered judgment of him. The girl praises his looks, but still backhandedly points out that his age is, well, a bit disappointing. She even goes on to probe why in the world a girl would live with a guy who's not even her boyfriend in such a tiny apartment. But despite all this, Yoshida overall seems like a decent guy to Sayu. While Sayu prepares their dinner, Asami bombards the timid guy with incisive questions. It turns out, Sayu has found a way to fabricate the reason behind the pair's connection. She told her new coworker that she and Yoshida were childhood friends, which Asami found quite odd because of their 9-year gap. To support her story, Sayu even lies that her parents were always away, so Yoshida watched over her. As the conversation continues, Yoshida mentions that Sayu does the cooking and all the other household chores in the apartment. Asami asks what he does in return, and Yoshida almost makes a slip of the tongue about the true origin of their relationship. Fortunately, Sayu announces that dinner's almost ready, allowing him to brush that matter off as he hurries to assist the teen. Over dinner, the trio becomes more comfortable with each other. Asami is amazed by Sayu's delicious cooking, noting that she envies Yoshida for being able to experience such culinary blessings every day. The house guest stays a little longer for drinks until she finally decides to leave. Surprisingly, she urges Yoshida to walk her home. Sayu's eager to come along too, but enigmatically, Asami tells her to stay as it's the man's job to see a lady out. While walking down the street, Asami suddenly asks Yoshida about his true relationship with Sayu, as if she isn't satisfied with what she heard in the apartment. Undeniably, she knows something's quite off. The salaryman isn't a very good liar. It was fairly obvious by how his eyes nervously moved around a lot as he touched on their quote-unquote past. Since it's obvious to Asami that what they said was all made up, she encourages Yoshida to reveal the truth this time. Taken aback by her perceptiveness, the man pauses to gather his thoughts on how to answer. With this, Asami is gracious enough to patiently wait for the truth. But when he finally speaks up, the answer isn't what she expected. What Sayu said is her own truth. Asami is initially confused, but then Yoshida adds that if Sayu sees him as a brother, there's no need for anybody else to argue otherwise. To Asami, this unfulfilling response just sounds like an admission of falsehood. However, Yoshida admits he's not the type of person to come up with a new lie to hide those Asami has already seen through. Besides, he thinks it's not his place to speak about matters Sayu wants to keep hidden. Thankfully, this reply satisfies the curious girl. All in all, Yoshida's surprisingly a swell dude. Sayu is definitely one fortunate girl. You can choose people you get involved with, but you can't choose who you meet. Asami doesn't dare to lock eyes with Yoshida as she relays these profound words. Asami thinks it's a stroke of good luck when you encounter a genuine person. Then suddenly, she instructs Yoshida not to walk her home anymore, and part of the reason is that she doesn't really want him to know where she lives. But before they part ways, Asami gives him a crucial piece of advice. Sayu's good at using different smiles, so be careful. The following day, Yoshida's supposed to head straight home after work, but Airiguto unexpectedly invites him to dinner. While sitting in the restaurant, Yoshida can't keep his eyes off his cell phone, waiting for Sayu's reply. Asami's advice replays in his head, making him worried about the teenager. He only snaps back to the present upon hearing Miss Airi's comments about their meal. It turns out that Airi has been closely monitoring Yoshida for quite some time. She's noticed some significant changes in his persona, such as his growing closeness with Yuzuha and the fact that he turned down a business trip for the first time. Airi also remarks that Yoshida now constantly plays around with his phone during working hours, which he doesn't normally do. So she wonders whether the salaryman is regularly contacting someone. Yoshida tries to process everything Miss Airi just noted, but before he responds, he first wants to ask her why she suddenly cares about everything he's been doing. While the situation's so perplexing to the man, Airi just casually drinks her beer, looking calm and confident like always. But then, her expression quickly shifts as she's about to answer. All of a sudden, the blushing woman sounds reluctant and her tone is soft and timid. "It's because I like you," she admits. And boy, does Yoshida suddenly forget to breathe after hearing that. Meanwhile, Sayu is busy cooking dinner, excited about Yoshida's arrival. After she's finished, she immediately grabs her phone to text the man, but all her excitement goes down the drain when she reads his message. He won't be home for dinner tonight as he's eating out with Miss Airi. Back at the restaurant, Yoshida vehemently refuses to believe Miss Airi. After all, she did mention that she had a boyfriend of 5 years, which is precisely why she rejected him. But Miss Airi confesses it was all a lie. She always liked him, and in fact, she was really happy when he admitted his feelings to her. However, she declined his advances because she thought it wasn't the right time. Yoshida still doubts her intentions as he surmises she's only confessing to make fun of him. So to prove she's telling the truth, Yoshida suddenly asks Miss Irie to sleep with him. For the record, guys, he isn't serious. He's just testing whether her feelings are legitimate, but he immediately regrets it when his crush confesses that she's never done it with anyone yet. Yoshida finds that absolutely unbelievable, but Miss Irie insists it's true. And so after a pregnant silence, Yoshida tells Miss Irie he'll wait. He stresses that he'll never ask her out again, but when the time comes, Miss Irie can ask him to date her. She really messed with his head when she rejected him using a lie. After all, Yoshida sincerely liked her. Well, he likes her even now. That's why if she truly reciprocates his feelings, he wants her to be the one to make the first move. Of course, Miss Irie understands this, so she promises that she'll surely ask him to date her in due course. Now that everything's settled though, it's Yoshida's turn to answer a few questions of her own. But before that, let's go back to the salaryman's apartment. Poor Sayu is having dinner all by herself. She thought she was already used to solitude, but being alone makes her feel isolated again. Just then, she remembers a familiar voice calling her name, which triggers bad memories and makes her feel sick. Sayu immediately runs to the bathroom, and there a single thought crosses her mind. If only Yoshida had come home as promised, things wouldn't have turned out this way. She immediately scolds herself for being pathetic again by blaming others for her suffering. Then suddenly, Sayu receives a message from Yoshida. She's shocked when it displays that he's bringing Miss Irie to their apartment. Sayu replies that she'll go somewhere else, and at this point, the girl assumes she'll be abandoned once more. However, another message arrives from Yoshida. Sayu can't believe her eyes when she reads that Miss Irie wants to meet her. It turns out, Yoshida's informed Miss Irie about the minor he's living with. He's made sure to stick with her made-up plot, where Sayu is a childhood friend who ran away from home. However, knowing that an adult man residing with a minor female is borderline a crime, Miss Irie insisted upon seeing her. Not only that, but she even reminded Yoshida not to fall in love with her. The moment Miss Irie meets Sayu, she immediately acts friendly with her, exactly like an adult, trying to make a younger one feel comfortable in their presence. As they share some snacks, the house guest does all the talking, while Sayu only pipes up when she asks her something. Miss Irie asks Sayu if Yoshida did anything weird to her, albeit jokingly. The teenager immediately denies this supposition, even pointing out that Yoshida's lack of depravity surprises her too. Miss Irie then quips that perhaps Yoshida isn't into younger girls. This comment leads to some friendly banter between her and Yoshida. The pair are enjoying themselves so much that it makes Sayu uncomfortable. Miss Irie observes Sayu's silence, and like an auto response, the teen immediately places a smile on her face and says, "It's nothing." When Yoshida excuses himself to the bathroom, Miss Irie secretly convinces Sayu to talk to her privately. Although this move startles the girl, she still agrees, as there are also many things she's eager to learn about their guest. And so, Sayu requests her housemate to purchase some ingredients for her. Yoshida is hesitant to leave Sayu alone with his boss, but the teenager reassures him that she'll be okay. As expected, Miss Irie asks tons of questions, like she's investigating a case. Are you really in high school? Where did you come from? When did you leave home? Sayu truthfully answers all these questions straight away and without giving unnecessary details. But when Miss Irie asks why she ran away, Sayu vehemently refuses to answer. Although her reluctance disconcerts the lady, she respects Sayu's silence. Still, Miss Irie points out she needs clarification on one more thing, something that only she, a complete stranger, can ask. How long are you going to stay here? Sayu doesn't have an answer to that question either, and so Miss Irie can only sigh at how risky this whole situation is. Still, she decides to explain what needs to be pointed out. Right now, no matter how much Sayu struggles and makes mistakes, all she'll be labeled as is a young teenage girl. However, it's entirely different for adults, so Yoshida might be alright with her setup, but society won't be. All in all, Miss Irie is saying that their situation might paint Yoshida in a negative light. After mentioning all these things, Miss Irie is surprised when Sayu thanks her. All this time, Sayu's hide the idea that she wants to run away from everything to forget, but the wise lady has made her realize that maybe she's just waiting for someone to encourage her to stay. At this point, Sayu admits everything she's done to survive since she left home, leaving Miss Ichi speechless. The lady can't even look straight at Sayu's face as the poor girl recounts her horrifying experiences. Undoubtedly, it feels heartbreaking to hear that a teenager had to sleep with different men in exchange for a few nights of stay. But then Sayu shares how Yoshida told her that what she was doing was wrong. The teenager even emphasizes that not only did the gentleman do nothing to her, but he also promised that he'd set her right. For a second, Miss Ichi quietly stares at Sayu's smiling face until she cracks up, stating that she can't help but imagine her conversation with Yoshida. Then the lady mentions she's relieved Sayu found a place where she can be safe. With this, she reassures the girl it's okay to let Yoshida be kind to her as long as it's done in an appropriate way. Sayu admits she still doesn't want to return home, but she's also aware she can't remain in these circumstances forever, and so she decides that eventually she'll face her past, vacate the apartment, and return to where she came from, for both her sake and Yoshida's. Miss Ichi embraces her, proud that Sayu's finally realized what's the right thing to do, and for the first time, the poor teenager bawls her eyes out, pouring out all the burdens she's been carrying inside. Meanwhile, it turns out that Yuzuha has accompanied Yoshida to the grocery store. As they're about to part ways, his colleague suddenly asks him if he'd allow her to stay at his place tonight. There's a hint of jealousy in Yuzuha's tone, as she'd been stalking Yoshida and Miss Ichi since the two got off from work together. Back in the apartment, Sayu has calmed down, and now it's her turn to ask a question. She only has one inquiry. Are you in love with Yoshida-san? The poised lady immediately bursts out in laughter. Miss Ichi didn't see this coming, but Sayu insists that the answer is important to her and Yoshida. Therefore, with sincerity in her heart, Miss Ichi admits she's truly in love with Yoshida. The truth is, she's been watching him since the day he arrived at the company. After hearing this, Sayu says she's relieved that Yoshida will nab the heart of the girl he loves. She also reassures Miss Ichi that she'll support her feelings. As for Yoshida, he's already explained himself to Yuzuha, who thought he'd taken Miss Ichi home to sleep with her since Sayu had already left. With this, she points out it doesn't make sense to leave the woman you love alone with a random teenager you're living with. Even Yoshida thinks it's strange, but he can't do anything about it. It's not like he can just suddenly kick Sayu out. And so Yuzuha asks him what his priority really is. She knows Yoshida's not the kind of person who can spontaneously evict the poor girl. Still, it makes her wonder whether he truly loves Miss Ichi or his feelings towards Sayu are changing. Of course, Yoshida firmly denies the latter. If that's the case, then maybe Yoshida is just too nice. But then, before Yuzuha leaves, she shares that when you're too nice, you won't get the things you really desire. That's a little tidbit for Yoshida to ponder. When he returns home, he's surprised to catch the girls getting along so well while doing makeup. Then Sayu suddenly asks Yoshida how she looks all dolled up. Yoshida blushes upon seeing Sayu's beautiful face, and he stutters, causing the girls to tease him for such a shaky response. The time has come for Miss Ichi to go home. While Yoshida's seeing her out, the lady divulges that she thinks Sayu's a good girl, but she also tells him that Sayu's unstable and doesn't understand herself at all. That's why there's no telling what emotions she possesses that might suddenly burst out. Despite all this, she reassures Yoshida will be okay no matter what. After all, at work, the bosses don't call him the problem solver for nothing. He always goes out of his way to deal with even the biggest issues. Therefore, Yoshida will surely find a way out when challenges arise with his current situation. Besides, he wouldn't have decided to take a runaway teenager in if he wasn't serious about taking care of her. And so, although more people are beginning to become aware of their situation, Yoshida and Sayu continue to live together, mutually learning from one another's experiences. They might face more challenges along the way, but with supportive companions to give them substantial advice about their circumstances, they'll surely be able to handle all